Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is a special Alumni Network lecture, Ekphrastic Adventures, Writing in Response to Art, with Paul Caponigro and Richard Blanco. My name is Elizabeth Greenberg. I'm the provost here at Maine Media, and we love to join you for these Alumni Network lectures. And of course, we always love seeing you when you join us here in Rockport. Today, we're here with Paul and Richard to explore the dynamic intersection between image and language through the practice of ekphrastic poetry, a form of writing that vividly describes or is inspired by works of art. From ancient times to today, ekphrastic poetry has offered a way to not just reflect upon art, but enter into a creative dialogue with it, extending the experience of seeing into an experience of feeling, imagining, and expressing. Guiding us on this adventure through images and words today are two extraordinary artists. Paul Caponigro, a renowned visual artist and writer whose work seamlessly weaves photography, text, environmental themes, and profound meditations on place and presence. Richard Blanco, the fifth presidential inaugural poet in U.S. history, is celebrated for his lyrical, deeply human poems that bridge worlds of identity, belonging, and cultural memory. You can join Richard in person here in Rockport for his workshop at the end of June. And I think Beth is putting some notes on that in the chat. Together today, Paul and Richard are going to lead us in this engaging conversation about photography through words and help us deepen our connection to the images we see and the stories they stir within us. So without further ado, I want to thank Paul and Richard for joining us, and thank all of you for joining and for your support of our alumni network. Thanks so much. Over to you guys.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
I wanted to welcome everybody. Thank you, Elizabeth. Great intro. Thank you, Maine Media, for building this community and sustaining it. And thank you all for coming and being a part of that today. I don't think I'd be here today without Richard. I was just mentioning before, I think his workshop is coming up in June. In 2020, I looked at the Maine Media catalog and said, gee, I'd like to take that workshop, but I can't. I'm teaching a printing workshop in my studio. And then COVID came. And suddenly I said, oh, I can. Online. And so here I am today. Poetry has entered into all of my publications. It has a space on the walls in my exhibitions, and it's changed the kinds of conversations I'm having about my work and that I hear other people having about the work while I'm there, or even hear about long after. I want to emphasize that it's really, while we're coming at it from a poetic standpoint, it really is more of a hybrid way of thinking, just as it's art responding to art. This could include prose, poetry, hybrid forms of writing, and I want to encourage you to hold this lightly and think of it less as a finished product, more of a process, particularly today, and particularly when we do the generative portion of this. Perfection is the enemy of the good, right? So let me show you a few resources so you don't have to take notes frantically. I'm going to share my screen and point out where I've gathered some of these resources. We're here also promoting the Camden Festival of Poetry, which I've since gotten involved in, part of the board there. And so is Meg Weston, who was a former director here at Maine Media and since spearheaded this, and was part of that workshop with Richard. And we continue to write, and I will probably read you a short poem that I just reviewed in our writing group last Saturday. That group continues to meet 5 years later. That QR code will help you get to that resource, but if you just go to my blog and you look for the Camden Festival of Poetry, you'll find these following resources. If Bridge will advance. Yes. So Camden Festival of Poetry, at the bottom of that, there's a whole series of ekphrastic events I'm doing, but at the bottom of that post, I've collected all kinds of resources for you, including some of the poems I'm going to refer to. One of them that I'll read a couple of literary journals that feature ekphrastic writing, even responses to my art. I've since gone and offered my images to the Ekphrastic Review and to Rattle, and it's been fascinating as an artist to see how people respond to my images as well. I figured if I'm doing it to other artists, I should see how it feels. And it's really fascinating. I mean, absolutely fascinating. So a lot of resources there. You don't need to take notes frantically. And of course, there will be the recording here as well. One of the resources there is for this particular prompt. If there's any kind of password that you find on the resources on my website, it just means you need to sign up for my newsletter. But by signing up for this presentation, you're automatically signed up for my newsletter. You're going to get a follow-up newsletter, especially just for this section, that will collect all of these resources and give you links to them. So when you get that email in the next day or two, that's where it's coming from. And if you don't want to get future resources, just unsubscribe. Just hit unsubscribe. So, ekphrasis, ekphrasis, potato, potato. If it sounds like Greek to you, well, it is. It's Greek for description. But I want to speed this along because there's so much to cover here. I consider it less a genre and more a mode of inquiry. I just was on another workshop yesterday with an outfit in London that is using poetry as inquiry in the sciences and psychology. It's absolutely fascinating, this whole notion of poetic inquiry. Scientists are looking for ways to message their information in a stickier way. And also they're looking at the experiential aspects that they're realizing not everything happens up in our head. Sometimes it happens in the body, sometimes it happens in the heart, that experience can really enrich our understanding and our inquiry. So the main distinction I would make here is it's not writing about art, it's responding, it's art responding to art. And that really starts to open it up. This word ekphrasis is starting to apply to music that's written in response to images. Maybe Mussorgsky's pictures at an exhibition is an ekphrastic work. Of course, some of the things we're going to be reading to you are poems made in response to sculpture. So the question is, what exactly is ekphrastic? How is it evolving? I think it's fast evolving. And what will it become tomorrow? Because what we do today shapes how it will um, manifest in the future. Richard, anything you want to add to that?
No, yeah, it's true. It's the field, so to speak, is really broad, and there's I can think of a poem that I consider an ekphrastic, and it's about Nancy Sinatra's music. So,
Yeah,
sometimes plays. I've done ekphrastic poems based on someone's entire body of work, or well, not their entire body of work, but the work as a whole, not just one particular piece. And you're right, JP. I think it's the idea of art responding to art and see what happens in that magic. And we'll get into that a little bit more, but and also this is more about structure, but for those poets out there, one of the most difficult things about writing a poem, right, is finding those parameters, right? Where to begin, what's the middle, what's the end, when free verse really isn't free. And I always turn to an ekphrastic as so it gives us some kind of mode, some kind of parameter with which to focus. And I think that's also the benefit of always having this sort of in your toolkit when you wanna write a poem.
right. Let me ask another really important question. Why write it? For me, it's about connecting. It's expanding my understanding of work. If I take the time to really dig in, I might need to do some research on the work of art or the artist. That informs me. I think this actually ties in really well to the slow looking movement. The average amount of time spent in a gallery or a museum looking at an individual image is somewhere between 15 and 30 seconds. People go fast, but if you're going to write something, you got to slow down and you got to be a little more selective. Obviously, you can't write a poem about every image in the Museum of Modern Art, right? So you're going to be choosy about what you spend your time with. Along the way, though, I think we also discover a lot about ourselves. I was listening to Rula Maria Dibbs yesterday, the Jungian psychologist who's helped guiding this poetic inquiry workshop I'm taking, and she was saying, if the poet's not there, there's no poem there. Like, that's really interesting. So it's also a journey of self-discovery, just like making our images or just like doing our writing. So there's this tremendous sense of connection to the work of art, connection to a community, connection to ourselves. And it's a wonderful way of considering things in a more thoughtful, mindful way. Couple of
Yeah.
questions. Anything you want to jump in there before I ask a couple of
Yeah,
questions?
no, I was going to say, so now they even just take pictures of the art so they can look at it at home, right? Those
Actually, I think that's really important. Like if you're going to finish the poem that you started in the museum, like maybe you want to work really fast and free because you want to experience a lot of art. Take a picture. Maybe they don't have it in the gift shop, or you don't have a version of it on the bookstore online. Definitely take a picture. And so that's interesting as well. It's like photography plays a role in poetry in another way. I mean, you're talking in your workshop about the relationship between photography and poetry very specifically. But again, here's another little bit. Those little snapshots can be really useful.
Yeah, and also you're right about I always tell my students the poem is not about anything. Well, the poem is first about the poet, that the poet is our who guides us, holds our hands through their emotional journey in a poem, and I think that's important to know that that's part of the ekphrastics. It's as much about the writer, the speaker, as it is about the art.
Yeah. So we're really getting to these first two questions. How is it ekphrastic? We're going to do a generative exercise where we talk about different aspects of work, but also I think it's really important to ask how ekphrastic is it? Meaning, where's the balance between the writer and the art object? And sometimes people will just, in fact, we read one yesterday. We'll just take the art as a prompt and just sail off into another. There's no description of the work. It's hard to know that the two were even related unless there's a little epigraph or it's in the title. It seems like a completely new thing. Maybe that's 1% ekphrastic, as opposed to a very literal description where there isn't a lot of interpretation and it's maybe 90% ekphrastic. The psychologist yesterday was saying on a scale between introverted and extroverted. That's interesting. How much is it responding to the outside? How much to the inside? And where's that meeting place? And there's no perfect amount for that. Really, it's just an interesting window into what's going on and what's being said. We could ask that of anything that we read. Uh, Richard alluded to how does form shape the response? The forms that we take or the forms that we give it not only shape our thinking, but they also shape the way that people respond to it. I think what's the prompt? We're going to give you a couple of prompts, and I might suggest a few others at the very end of this session. But just the question that you ask, like how you approach the work, is really the seed for the development of something, and the seed that you plant bears a different fruit. The other question that Richard and I were talking about, like, can it stand on its own? Like, can you read the piece of writing afterwards and it's still a really cool piece of writing? You don't necessarily have to look at the artwork, though when the two come together, they get even richer. And I think that's the important thing. We're layering, we're connecting, we're expanding the whole field. And I honestly think in a lot of cases, the art experience is an experience, not an object. The object becomes a catalyst for future experiences. And this is one way that we can have much deeper and more personal experiences. Anything to add there, Richard, before we go into our next section?
No, I was going to say that I think that how close, how ekphrastic is also part of how the form has evolved or throughout the years, right? And I think the other thing that calls to mind is uh, uh, I always tell my classes when you use an illusion that one of the greatest things is that the reader, even if you don't know the painting, that the reader wants to look it up, right? So it's still very much the poem, and it
Mhm.
cannot necessarily, but it should intrigue. Part of it is to have people intrigued about the artwork itself, or the object, or the film, or whatnot. And I think that's part of what's going on in ekphrastic, that it leads the reader and also into that space, into that world for them to be the observer and contemplator of the work themselves.
Yeah, and I love when people open up a new way of looking at artwork. Sometimes I'm left flat by something, but somebody else is really passionate about it, and their understanding of it can often rub off on me. Say, oh, I never thought of it that way. It gets more interesting. So hopefully that synergy can happen. Let's get into some poems. Let's actually hear some of this stuff, and I'll mention a couple to follow up with. But wanted to start with Richard's great reading voice. Um, and of course, when we're talking about it, it's just a classic poem. Richard, take it away.
Yeah, this is a classic poem that's been with me for since graduate school. And here it is. Uh, Archaic Torso of Apollo by Rainier Maria Rilke. We cannot know its legendary head with eyes like ripening fruit, and yet his torso is still suffused with brilliance, from inside, like a lamp in which his gaze, now turned to low, gleams in all its power. Otherwise, the curved breast could not dazzle you so, nor could a smile run through the placid hips and thighs to that dark center where procreation flared. Otherwise, this stone would seem defaced beneath the translucent cascade of the shoulders and would not glisten like a wild beast's fur, would not, from all the borders of itself, burst like a star. For here there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life.
Terrific.
That
What do you
last
love,
line.
what do you love about that poem?
Um, well, first of all, the very dramatic closure, right? That conclusion, that is, that is so well earned, as we say, but just some of the incredible descriptions and metaphorical descriptions of the smile of the smile that runs through the placid hips and thighs, just would not glisten like a wild beast's fur. But to me, also, just in a journalist is saying, here's time, beauty, history, and when you really stop and look, you must change your life, right? How could we not see this and not understand that there's and what that change means may mean many different things for the viewer, right? But
Mm.
but that there because of art itself makes us change our lives, right? So it's such a beautifully encapsulated sentiment and directive.
Yeah, we could talk about this one for 5 more minutes. I just would say that it's very interesting to see this is a pivotal moment for Rilke as he's the assistant to Rodin. And Rodin is saying, stop getting so airy-fairy, start go and write about some things. And this is what he wrote about. And I've looked at this sculpture before reading the poem, and I would never have come to the conclusion of, you must change my life. I mean, your life. But at the same time, now having read the poem, I get exactly where he goes, and I love it even more. The other thing I wanted to highlight is if I read this poem, it would feel different. If Rilke read this poem, it would feel different. And you really got it across to me how much um, all writing really, but poetry in particular. They often talk about poetry as sung. There's something very musical about it. The act of reading, of hearing somebody else read it, is really, really fascinating.
Yeah, and I should mention this is a translation, so I
Yeah.
can imagine how much more powerful it would be in the original. Yeah.
So local poet translator Mark Burrows did that exactly for us. He's got, beautiful accent. He's a Rilke scholar, and it's so interesting to hear it in the original language as well. And that's important. Yeah. All right. So I want to just survey a couple of things going through here, a couple of resources to follow up, and then we'll share one more. These are some of the classics that I've scrubbed. The links are all up on my website. You can actually hear some of the poets, like the one that I'm going to read you. Yosu Kominyaка is facing it. You can actually hear Kominyaка read the poem. Totally cool. Um, this has been going on for a long time. It seems like everybody's tracking back to Homer when they're talking about the Shield of Achilles. Now, of course, the Shield of Achilles, this is not the actual Shield of Achilles. This was made long after. So Homer wrote the poem in theory about a possibly historical shield, but the poem survived and then somebody went and recreated it. Kind of fascinating. There's so many other fascinating things, including follow up with Auden's version of the Shield of Achilles. Really, really fascinating. This is Keats's sketch of his Ode to a Grecian Urn, the sketch of a
Wow.
Grecian urn that he was actually looking at in the museum. I have this theory that a lot of this stuff was happening before photography, and that when we talk about ekphrasis as description, okay, so you go to Rome and your friends back in London say, "What'd you see?" Well, what are you going to do? You're going to write a poem. You don't have a snapshot to take. And I think the fact that there is photography today changes the type of poems or writing that we do in response. There's a deep relationship to that. Of course, we've just looked at Rilke, or rather, we heard Rilke and looked at the torso. The relationship between Blake, between images and text, is just so rich. Whether he's making a painting in response to Dante's Divine Comedy or whether he's illustrating his own texts. Here we can ask which came first, the poem or the picture. Probably the poem, that's my theory, but the two are interchangeable and just wonderful, wonderful chemistry between them. Probably the most responded to piece of artwork would be Van Gogh's Starry Night. Of course, Anne Sexton's poem is also a classic about it, and it's well worth reading. Short, beautiful thing. And you might want to go and follow up with a few other responses to that, see how very different people, very fine poets, have all responded to the same object. And it just gets Hall and Mirror more complex. I'm going to pause on this one. I'm going to end on this one and read you this Yusuf Komunyakaa poem. It's in response to the Vietnam Memorial. Let me just preface this ahead of time. One of the reasons I love this poem is this is all about his experience, less about the actual object, though it's very much present. This is more along the very personal response. But think about also the cultural context that we're in. You have this very white monument in a very white Washington, D.C. You have an African-American Vietnam vet coming and looking at his comrades that have fallen etched into this black reflective wall, who was designed by an Asian American sculptor, Maya Lin. Talk about complicated. Holy smoke. I mean, anyway. My black face fades, hiding inside the black granite. I said I wouldn't. Damn it. No tears. I'm stone. I'm flesh. My clouded reflection eyes me like a bird of prey, the profile of night slanted against morning. I turn this way. The stone lets me go. I turn that way. I'm inside the Vietnam Veterans Memorial again. Depending on the light to make a difference, I go down the 58,022 names, half expecting to find my own in letters like smoke. I touch the name Andrew Johnson. I see the booby trap's white flash. Names shimmer on a woman's blouse. But when she walks away, the names stay on the wall. Brushstrokes flash, a red bird's wings cutting across my stare. The sky. A plane in the sky. A white vet's image floats closer to me. Then his pale eyes look through mine. I'm a window. He has lost his right arm, inside the stone. In the black mirror, a woman's trying to erase names. No, she's brushing a boy's hair. Complicated. Wonderful. And I really recommend that you listen to him read it. It's so interesting to hear that. So poetry as a kind of performance. Form, something Richard is a master of. He could teach in, well, he has taught entire workshops on single forms. A couple of things I want to highlight here. This is Dean Rader's response to Cy Twombly. He wrote an entire book in response to an exhibit of Cy Twombly's work at the Gagosian Gallery. And you can see the little stanzas kind of mirror the form of the painting. Not all of the forms are that mimetic, but it is a fascinating kind of response to Twombly's drawing. And of course, Rader has made it his own as well. So this notion of prose poem, something Richard is a master at. I've scrubbed Cloud Anthem out of his book. Notice it's just one long block of text, right? And you could say that line breaks aren't there, but all the lines are relatively even. There's a lot of work going into making all those lines exactly even, but it reads a little differently. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you, Richard, is like, how do we make prose a little more poetic? I'm sure there are dozens of ways, but let's just toss a few things out.
Yeah. Well, as far as a prose poem, in my understanding, it should have everything that a poem should have except line breaks, obviously, right? And it can be very liberating. And sometimes when I'm stuck and the things aren't coming to me in lines, and I'm not finding energy in the line breaks, I will write out in a prose block, and then start trimming and start cutting, and then start seeing how the form is retaking shape. And sometimes it goes back and it wants to be a prose poem. Prose poems, I also tend to write when I feel like sometimes I don't want to interrupt the flow of the poem in any way. But other than that, everything else applies: figurative language, imagery, whatnot. So But as far as prose itself, besides the prose poem form, I would say when you're looking at prose, if let's say you're going to respond to an artwork through a piece of prose, um, to always think about compression of language, which also applies to poetry,
Mm.
to not get too prosy, so to speak. That that we, no matter what genre you're writing in, the best thing I think is to say the most with the least amount of words. That's one thing. The other thing that perhaps prose loses sometimes, that a poem naturally has because of the line breaks, is to have a prose rhythm, right? A narrative rhythm, right? So that longer sentences, shorter sentences, a very dramatic pause, So that's another way of sort of thinking about how to make a prose piece more poetic. And again, employing similes, metaphors, all kinds of figurative language can empower prose. But when we're speaking about how things are blending and layering, these days also, what is the lines are so wonderfully blurred between what is a flash fiction and what's a prose poem and what is a what is a in hybrid forms like a lyrical essay with a poem in the middle. What is creative nonfiction, and so I would say, however you feel comfortable responding to something, try it that way, and then explore and experiment with it. See if you like. Maybe the prose poem wants to have a shape and a form and stanzas and moves differently than one block. So, yeah.
I'm hearing play while you're writing and play after you're writing.
This
What?
particular poem was interesting because my choice there because it speaks about clouds, and clouds as a metaphor for coexistence. I kind of felt like it was. You could have said, "Oh, I'm going to put a little different clouds in each stanza as a cloud," But I just saw it like one long connected body of like one long wisp of clouds and the way the clouds are moving and they're always constantly flowing and flowing and flowing, and so that's why I decided to. It's hell to read because you can lose your place. I mean, when I read it at a reading, but and I think the line breaks were also trying to do that to make you sort of shift and keep on shifting, and the way that clouds mesh into another cloud, mesh into another cloud. So that was my kind of thinking behind this particular piece.
Yeah. And I love the rhythm of until. There's this rhythmic beat of that one word or that one seed, and it really glues the whole thing together and gives it a kind of a rhythmic musicality to the whole thing.
And this is an ekphrastic.
Is it?
You would never know it.
No, I wouldn't. It's in response to what? I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah, yeah. That's in response to another poem we'll see later. In response to Jacob Hessler poem, the last poem in that Boundaries book. But what's interesting, this is when he took a photo. I wrote this poem, and then he didn't like his photo, and then he went back and took another photo to match the poem. So the interesting thing when we talk about ekphrastic, right? You're saying "Starry, Starry Night," right? It doesn't just exist with poetry, right? This happens across other genres of art, right? There's songs that include "Starry, Starry Night," right?
Right.
So think about you can all think about it that way too. Yeah.
That's fabulous. We'll come back to the two puns and you'll end on that. Two puns is a local publisher here that Richard and I have both worked with. Joyce has worked with. That's the next upcoming alumni lecture coming up soon. So yeah, we'll touch more on that. But I had no idea that this was in response, or that Jake then turned around and made another photograph. That's awesome. Kind of raised the bar and he said, "No, I
So,
need a
so it was an ekphrastic. Then he did an ekphrastic photo based on the poem. It was an ekphrastic of the original photo. It's kind of fun.
Well, it's that kind of synergy that I think
Hmm.
is so wonderful about this and that creative exchange. And it can lead to collaboration
Yeah.
between different disciplines for ourselves individually or between other artists. Really terrific. Um, there we go. My advance is just being a little sticky here, so sorry, folks. So I've asked Richard what makes prose more poetic, and then I also just kind of wanted to break it apart, prose and poem. Richard had mentioned briefly hybrid. I want to just mention this goes way back. Basho, father of haiku, though actually he didn't actually write haiku. Here's a little a translation of that. Remember, he's writing in Japanese. We got a little bit of haiga as well, images in there. It's a combination of prose plus the haiku. And you might be thinking, hey, wait a minute, haiku's 3 lines. Well, actually, in Japan, it was just one long vertical line. This is the frog poem and a more recent um, version of that. So it's a fast-moving international genre at this point. If you looked at Basho's Ancient Pond, frog jumps in the sound of water. Love it. 3 lines, but where's the 575? That's not 575, that's less. 575 or less. I like this one little anonymous haiku. Okay. So there's the form. But so really like, I think it's Jane Reichel just says it's the most minimal form with the most rules. And nobody totally agrees on exactly how a Western haiku quote should be. And my recommendation is that you don't should, just erase the should play. I think this is pretty clever. There's some really interesting parallels between haiku in particular, but this can also be to any of the condensed poems. Richard was talking about condensation, kind of really getting down to the essence. This notion of haiku being about direct observation with very little embellishment. Notice no punctuation, no rhyme, no. You try not to be fancy with language. It does a lot with a little and really tries to get down to the essence of things. And of course, we write a lot. I don't know how many words Basho wrote in order to finally get down to the few that he actually used. But just like photographers, we shoot a ton and then we show less than 1% of what we actually shoot. The editing process is important here. That is something I recommend you not do in the museum or the gallery. Do it later. You really want to fever write in these prompts that we're about to do now. And when you're on site, just get it out, get started. If you want more about haibun and haiku, haibun is the combination of prose plus the little haiku, which is what Basho primarily wrote. Here are resources. Those, again, are all collected up on my website. Just that one post will give you links to it. So let's get to the generative aspect of our session here. So now's the time to write. And again, perfect is the enemy of the good. We're not trying to make finished poems in 15 minutes or 3. Fantastic. But maybe you just get one idea. Maybe you get a brilliant line. Maybe you just plant the seed for an idea that you sleep on tonight and tomorrow something comes to you. Again, hold it loosely, play with this kind of thing. We're going to focus on 3 different lenses. I often think of the prompt as a lens. Like you put on a zoom lens on a camera and you see the world differently. You put on a wide angle lens, you see the world differently. Well, these little prompts can each be lenses. And we're going to focus on content first, form second, feeling third. We're going to break them down apart. Now, you might say every work of art has all 3 of these things, but to varying degrees. And it's really the balance that's struck that can often tell you what's going on. First, as the artist, like, okay, so what have I emphasized? Or second, as the viewer, what did the artist emphasize? And what kind of statement is being made? There is no perfect balance, right? Just like between the internal and the external in ekphrastic, it's not a perfect balance. It's like, what does the balance communicate? For this, there's a resource on my website that I often offer to my photography workshop participants, and I get them to consider that as well. Which images have a lot more information in them? Which images are more abstract? What's the appeal that's being made? We talked about this in our sessions, and I could look at this and say, if I did a formal analysis of this, wouldn't I be missing the point? If I start critiquing it, say, there's a little motion blur, it's a little grainy, the edges are a little rough. There's some enjambment, like, couldn't we get these figures, wait, pause for a second, kids, while you're running, and just sort of spread out a little so we can get some more space. Aren't I really missing the point here? And in fact, a lot of cases, journalists are trying to avoid picture perfect images. They want to emphasize the content and not make aesthetic objects out of it. There's a little bit of debate about some of Jim Nachtwey's work. I absolutely love his work. But within the journalistic community, there's the question about, should we make things look prettier, or does that actually make things more compelling? There's no easy answer to any of this. But if we were to say try and make a content evaluation of Richard Mizrak's sky book, just pick any image in it. They're all abstract skies, sometimes minimalist fields of color, sometimes streaks of stars. How much content is there? In fact, it points to the title as well. Mizrak's titles will often give you a date and a place. And it's kind of ironic because it's about the only thing that really makes these things representational, other than they are straight photographs. So different kinds of appeals and different kinds of work will support different kinds of responses. Anything before we get to our prompts, Richard?
No, no.
Okay.
We'll
So I
pause there.
wanted to offer up two. One on the left, my father's New York, 1964. I think I was in the womb for that one. Um, Interesting title, right? You didn't say Apple. Sometimes we call it, well, I'm not going to tell you what we call it. Some of you may know. It's a lead. Sorry, I will tell you later. And on the right, my Plano Bay, Antarctica 19, no, sorry, 2007. Okay. And for the next 3 minutes, I want to encourage you to write down, pick one image and write down anything that comes to mind about the content of the thing. Try and avoid formal statements like, you know, the shape of the thing, the texture of the thing, the lines, the color. We're going to do that next. Just go for the content of the thing. And we'll come back in 3 minutes. Okay. If anybody has a word, a phrase, a sentence that they'd like to share in the chat, go ahead and pop it up. And I'll just drop it into the chat there. I'm going to encourage people to save the chat later on. It'd be interesting to see some of the responses. And of course, there are going to be many questions at the end that we won't be able to get to, but may be able to follow up with. Um, it was interesting. I hope that you're looking at the quality of mind, and I hope now as we shift, I'm going to encourage you to stay focused on the same image. You don't have to, but you'll gain more out of this exercise if you do it with just the same image and approach it a little differently. And now take just 3 minutes and fever, right? Phrases. Don't worry about finished sentences, punctuation, spelling. Nobody's correcting any of that right now. Again, that's for later. And just focus on the form. Here again, we're looking at the kinds of things I mentioned before: shape, line, texture, color, tonality. Not necessarily the subject matter, the place, the time, but more what you see, the kind of thing that ekphrastic description really tends to emphasize. Take another 3 and capture a few thoughts and responses to that. All right. Let's shift gears a final time, as they say, one more time with feeling. Here, I really do want to encourage you to think about your emotional responses to these things. Here's a wonderful opportunity to forward your internal, more subjective responses to these. They might be touched off. I always think it's fascinating that we use the word feeling for both the senses, like texture, we've already alluded to that in form, and emotion. And emotion is another way of sensing, another way of understanding things. Here, I want you to focus simply on any emotional reactions to that, but they might be catalyzed by some of the observations you've already made. And we'll come back to that in just a second. So take a final 3 minutes. Share anything else in the past that you would like in the chat, and we'll come back on the feeling as well. Just write about the feeling. Okay. Did that feel different? One of the questions I wanted to ask. Um, yeah, I know we were emphasizing a feeling, but the quality of mind that we're approaching. Are you responding differently? Are you noticing different things? Are you using your focus to get after a certain aspect, but it shapes the experience. And I want to encourage you to uh, explore and play with how language shapes your experience, how you can use language to lean into something or move away from a certain quality of being. Probably more important than getting a final finished poem or making great art out of any of this is enriching your experience. So I want to encourage you that if you would have a phrase or an observation that you'd like to do, like pop it in the chat. It's always fun just to see what other people are coming up with.
Yeah, there's some cool things in the chat. But JP, I just want to add, like, as you were talking and I was watching this in real time, right? How and I just want to share with anyone, this is the same process I go through in writing a poem, whether it's an ekphrastic or not. Except in my poems, I first have to render my own images from memory and whatnot, and it's the imagery that then creates the feeling, or lets you lets you discover the feeling. And so in the case of the ekphrastic, Not that we have a head start, but the images and how we're contemplating those images. It's a very similar process, right?
Mm,
Of
mm,
writing a poem. Yeah.
yeah. So a couple of things here. To follow up on what you were saying, Richard, the prompt here was given in three pieces. So we kind of have a
Right.
little checklist. One of the other things that you can do is look at your responses. And let's say that you're looking at the senses. A great checklist is like 5 senses, or if you prefer 12. Don't do the 44. That's too long a checklist. Um, just go through the 5 senses and say, so which sense am I orienting towards most? A lot of people orient visually first, but maybe in response to a particular experience you're having, you've leaned into another sense. Also, that could point to something you might bring into the writing and say, hey, I forgot to think about the smell of can I get smell in there? Can I get the smell of an apple? Can I get the smell of an iceberg? Would that enhance the delivery in the final thing? So just these little checklists, these prompts can be really terrific. One of the things I'd love for you to do, and we won't take the time right now to do it because I want to move into questions and a final readings. Um, each of these separate little chunks can now be mixed and matched. One of the interesting things to do is to take something from content, from form and feeling, and mix them into a new arrangement of those in a way that the two pieces that you put together either compare, they're just like each other, or they contrast. They give you a different kind of lens. Sometimes poetry turns on those sudden, unusual twists, not just of language, but also of the combination of things. Much like a good photograph, you never really thought of looking at it in that way, or you never thought about the relationship between two particular objects. There's a wonderful opportunity to do this. I'll also encourage you as you're looking at any statements that are up on museum walls or in catalogs, and just like, so what kind of appeal are they making here? Is this primarily a formal appeal? Are they appealing mostly to content? How are they mixing the two? Are they jumping between them in a way that is um, not, it doesn't really explain much. It's just kind of a lot. They're just kind of going through a checklist, or have they connected the two in a really interesting way and shown us how the form really reflects the content in a very meaningful way and helps us understand the statement that's being made and how well it's being made. So this can be a really powerful tool, and I encourage you to look at this content, form, feeling, not just in your own writing, but also in other people's writing, and as a window into looking at what somebody is trying to do, either with images or with words. Really useful there. We're moving in towards the end. Um, I think we've got time for questions here, Richard, before we move into
Yeah.
our final readings. Unless unless you want me to read mine. Um, shall I read mine in response to Dad's?
Sure.
Yeah, it's short. Um, so about 10 days after Dad passed last November, um, I wrote this response to the Galaxy Apple. That's what Dad called it. It was kind of the code name in the studio, and it didn't always. Once in a blue moon, it would be used in publication, but it really is one of the images that got me most interested in photography. It's my favorite image of his. It really changed things for me. And one of the things that was often fascinating for me to hear him discussing the power of metaphor in imagery. Um, so constantly with abstraction with his colleagues, Minor White, a number of others, they were constantly talking about the power of metaphor. To photograph, Minor White has a great phrase, I photograph a thing not only for what it is, but for what else it is. It was fascinating to see metaphor coming in for visual artists. So this is the little piece that I wrote and recently um, presented to the writing group with Meg, who's here today, and some of the other in the 9 poets that came out of that Richard Blanco workshop in 2020 for us, and we're still meeting today. We actually have a video up on the Poets Corner as well, which Meg started reading our poems. This one is called "How to Turn an Apple into a Galaxy." Bring the outside inside. Savor desire without succumbing. Let it live in the center of your room. Allow days to flow. Focus, a single eye. Blink, illumination. Enter the darkest room. Shine radiance on silver-seated sheets. Pass flesh through alchemical pools. Darken the fruit beyond recognition. Lift the liquid latent image's second sight. Let it curl dry. Loose the shadow back into light. Eat the thing you love. So it came pretty quickly. It needed a little tuning later. I want to encourage you to kind of pursue it. I wrote this in November. I've only just recently finished it now. It took a little tweaking. Sometimes, like those great songs for Mick Jagger and the rest of it, they come in a flash and they're pretty much done. Sometimes poetry's like that. Other times, you need to work on it for a long time, like Richard said. A lot of times they need some editing. This was 80% there, but the little tweaks make it stronger. And I think a lot of times we need some distance. Maybe you got something started today, or maybe you'll get something started tomorrow with something else, but you might want to just sort of put it aside and come back to it later. Richard, I want to, questions, and then I want you to read your two puns poem there. We're 3:26. Bethy, we okay going just a little bit longer? Excellent. Okay. I want to open this up to questions. Any questions you guys have? Want to make some space for that? Just pop them in the chat. We'll try and scrub some things. I'm not sure we can get to all of it. Well, certainly we have a certain amount of time here. Richard, do you see anyone that you'd like to respond to?
I haven't seen one yet. I don't know if they're coming in.
Or if it's easier, you can unmute and ask your question.
That'll turn it into a free for all. I'd rather scrub.
Yeah.
Well,
there's one writing at Ekphrastic about your own photography. This is what I do in that workshop that's coming up. Mostly, it's I encourage family photos because a lot of people are just beginning to write photography. But I think you follow the same kind of process of discovery. There's an element to discovering what it is. I mean, it's sort of like, so I would compare it to, like, sometimes I write a poem and then I go back to it and I'm like, oh, that's what I was thinking. So like, discover the things that you probably already did instinctually. But I think the beauty, and I know that a lot of photographers are including more and more of poetry responding to their own work in some ways in their photography books, including one of our own alumni, forget Australia. Anyway, so I would say it's still look for that discovery, that form, and don't be convinced of your feeling when you walk in, because the poem again should still be something that you haven't uncovered yourself, and they can be very, very interesting.
Yeah, and I'd love to kind of riff on that. I've often called ekphrasis the democratic antidote to art speak. So sometimes the kind of more personal response that we have on a personal essay, a description of your personal experience making the work or getting there, kind of enriches the experience. I think the kinds of statements that we want to, or I encourage my students to avoid, are the ones that kind of solve the equation of art rather than deepen the mystery. Let's say this art equals that. I just explained it. Did you get it? And it turns the whole thing into an illustration. Right? Rather than, I'm opening up doors and windows for things that you might want to consider. I'm adding layers of experience in there. I'm inviting you into a new experience. Let the words be a parallel. Yeah, I'm laughing only because a friend of mine said orthogonal experience, at right angles. I really want to make sure that we don't make the writing or the art an illustration. If it's a really good lyric essay or poetry, it lives on its own. It has its own life, with or without the artwork. And if it's really great artwork, it also has its own life, with or without the words. So they're not crutches for one another, but when they come into each other, it's like what Jung said, the meeting of two personalities is an alchemical event. If there's any chemistry at all, both are transformed. Well, that's the kind of synergy we're looking for. And it also helps you shape the kind of space that you're making for people.
There's a professor of mine once said, "Good art answers questions. Great art keeps asking them." Right?
Nice. That's awesome. Which is another great prompt, by the way. Ask 20 questions. Actually ask 100. Ask more questions. And in fact, you see it in the Blake thing. I know that Richard will sometimes say, "Hey, be careful about asking too many questions. Like, raise them in a different way. Don't just ask them." But that tiger poem, what the hammer, what the nail, like just full of questions, and it's brilliant, brilliant. So questions are another great thing. Somebody asked also, are there tools for so I get it just right? Are there tools for deepening your personal connection? Is there a tool for cultivating and resolving feelings associated with an object of art? It's like, yeah, that's what we're doing here. This is a way of deepening the process. I wouldn't think of it as resolving as much as coming into a deeper understanding of it, spending more time with it, being with it, and that's exactly what this provides. Plus, it also gives you a kind of a focus and some choices about how to approach it, as well as multiple options. And sometimes you want to approach things in more than one way and see what happens because you're not quite sure exactly how to get there. So you just got to try this stuff. Really
You know,
be playful.
I would go. I was just to go back to sort of the torso poem as a sort of a very pristine example, right? So here's all of the form, content, and then that last line is really, I could almost see like Roki, like, oh, this is what I'm feeling, right? You must change your life, right? And what you're saying earlier too, that you can mix that up, that it's also not just content for and form content and then the epiphany, so to speak. But there's no resolution there, rather just a discovery, an aha, and I would say trust the your image building, your form building, your content building to lead you to that point where you're going to go. It happens to me all the time. Like, oh, that's what I needed to discover. And then in some ways, that's not what poems are never done. But it was like now I know why I wrote this poem. Now I knew why I had to write this poem now.
But you don't always know until the end of the process, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I got to go through it. Um, the process itself is a way of knowing and discovery. It's great. Any other questions there? I got a fun one here. Do you find black and white images more evocative for emphasis? No, let me just flip that back on you. Do you find black and white images more? No right or wrong here. Like, but if you find that you're having that, then lean into that and ask some questions like, why? Why is it doing it for you? And like that's interesting. Like, there's another part of the whole creative process. Again, we want to avoid the should, but also just get curious about, why did I do that? Not in a way that is um, let's call it self-aware rather than self-conscious. When we start feeling like we have to justify our responses or, you know, get approval from somebody else, and we start shutting down that creative flow that we want to let loose. But it is really interesting now, the question, so why am I responding these ways? Not as a judgmental thing, but as a mindfulness practice. Like, oh, this is happening. This is taking me somewhere. That's interesting. Tell me more. And of course, it's your experience. So only you can tell you more about your experience. And it can be wonderful to try and share that with other people as well and find common ground.
I would love to see that question in an ekphrastic form of taking a color photograph and wondering what it looks like in black and white or vice versa. Like that question itself is the poem, right? It could be the part of like, what is my take on something?
So I love just by having a conversation, you've got a prompt for a new poem.
Yeah.
I also found it really interesting, your new book, Homeland of My Body. I was looking through it, and like the first section of your book, there's 9 ekphrastic poems in there,
Yeah.
and one of them is in response to one of Joyce's
Yeah.
as well. Do we want to move to the final reading, Richard?
I think so. I don't see any more. Some great comments, but I think the questions are not. I think we're done with the questions. Unless my feed on the chat is slow.
Well, we're coming into time here as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
So wanted to come back, local fine art publisher who has worked with a number of us. what Richard's going to read. He mentioned the Cloud Anthem is from Boundaries. He's going to read something from Boundaries as well, one of my favorite poems. We've also got a father and son book coming up this fall, and Joyce Tennyson has just released her Gold Trees. Again, that's an alumni session. It's been rescheduled. It's coming up. They did that book. Sig Harvey's, her images and her, both in Cake and in Eat Flowers. Wonderful books. They're limited edition, so they may be hard to actually find somebody who has one of these copies. But the Bowdoin College Library has one of every book that Two Ponds has done. It's a great place to go and see some wonderful publications. Also, a wonderful way to access this kind of stuff as well. And one of my favorites, and there is a trade edition of this, and it's still available, Boundaries, between Jake Hessler, who's taught at Maine Media, lives in Rockport, in Camden, and of course, our fabulous Richard Blanco. And I've asked him to read like one of my absolute favorite poems. I don't mean of his, I mean just plain old one of my absolute favorite poems, which just happens to be Ekphrastic. Is a Rio Grande poem.
No, I'm gonna kill me, but I just closed it by mistake. We're gonna open it again. Hold on. Oh my gosh. Sorry, guys. I was fiddling around with too many windows there.
Gonna confess I'm biased. I grew up in New Mexico. I've studied with Richard. He's become a good friend. He's been a great mentor and kind of laid the foundation for my recent poetic journey. So of course I'm biased on this one, but that doesn't
So,
not just an
yeah.
absolutely fabulous poem.
So as you can see from the photo, a couple things. Well, the whole book is obviously ekphrastics to some degree. We talked about how close this is to the object or not. This is very far away from the object in some ways. But again, when you put the two together, they start speaking to each other, and they're both all the more better for it. This is a picture of the border between U.S. and Mexico and the Rio Grande, and again, the theme was boundaries. That's an experience I can't speak to directly through my immigrant experience, and I thought, how do I solve this? So I thought of writing the poem of the river, and it became a bigger poem in the sense of it's really about the absurdity of boundaries in general. And so this is the poem sort of giving it to humanity, so to speak. And so it's also, some of these poems can combine modes. So a personification poem that is also an ekphrastic poem. Complaint of El Rio Grande. I was meant for all things to meet, to make the clouds pause in the mirror of my waters, home to fallen rain that finds its way to me, to turn eons of loveless rock into love-sick pebbles and carry them as humble gifts back to the sea, which brings life back to me. I felt the sun flare, praised each star flocked about the moon long before you did. I've breathed air you'll never breathe. Listen to songbirds before you could speak their names, before you dug your oars in me, before you created the gods that created you. Then countries, your invention. Maps jigsawing the world into colored shapes, caged in bold lines to say you're here, not there, you're this, not that, to say yellow isn't red, red isn't black, black is not white, to say mine, not ours, to say war, and believe life's worth is relative. You drew me, you named me, big, blue, thick, to divide, to say spick and Yankee, to say wetback and gringo. You split me in two, half of me us, the rest other, but I wasn't meant to drown children or hear mothers' cries. Never meant to be your geography, a line, a border, a murderer. I was meant for all things to meet. The mirrored clouds and sun single, bird songs and the quiet, the wind, its dust, the rush of mountain rain and us. Blood that runs in you is water flowing in me. Both life, both the truth. We know, we know. Be one in one another. Thank you.
Fabulous. Fabulous.
And so I just want to close on, I think what we're always doing, whether it's an ekphrastic poem or a regular poem, right? You know, we said about dad and the metaphor, you know, trying to pull a metaphor. This is essentially the construct of a metaphor, which is, right, vehicle and tenor. The vehicle now we're given, right? It's the object. It's a way to discover something. The vehicle is the tangible thing in the world, right? To discover a tenor, the intangible thing, love, hate, joy. And so in a sense, what's great about writing ekphrastic poems, we're given that tenor, right? I'm given this river, I'm giving this photo with which to start to discover something about, in this case, political topic, of an emotion, something more complex, that's far beyond the sum of its parts. So
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. It just gets so much richer.
yeah.
I've lived there. I've written about the river. That's a poem I couldn't write. Or just couldn't use certain kinds of language, have a different perspective, and that's great. I'd be fascinated to see somebody else write in response to Rio Grande. It just keeps layered. The thing that I want to emphasize there is that this is a new experience that the two have kind of lifted each other up or made each other denser or connect
Yeah.
out to more, and it just keeps living. It doesn't limit the thing; it
Right,
expands it.
right.
I think that's what's wonderful about this kind of experience. It expands experience.
And I hope everyone can see that. I went through that same process, right? I'm looking for what's the content. Yes, I saw the mirror, how the sunlight is reflected like a mirror, and like that started me going and going and going and going. So as they say in our biz, right? Never give somebody a prompt you haven't tried yourself. So and we have tried them.
Great. I want to point out a couple more things before we leave. I'm doing this again next week, and we'll be responding to some different images of my father for the International Photography Hall of Fame. That's also online, but there are a whole bunch of other events leading up to the Camden Poetry Festival, which again, I hope this encourages you to get involved. If anybody was suffering from fear of poetry before they got here, get over it. It's wide open and so much fun. Come play with us. Come hear some wonderful poets read their work. Come hear more about craft. There's so much to experience, as well as there's some performative things in town as well. Also wanted to mention two poets. Annalie is doing a lot of the graphic work and promotional work for Main Media right now. She's the designer for Boundaries and also for Caponigro Conversations and Cake. And like Annalie is very much here and present. So there's kind of a wonderful community tie-in to all of this. Again, resources up on the website there. And I want to thank you guys for coming, and thank you, Main Media, Bethy, Elizabeth, Annalie, for hosting, for shepherding this, and all of you for coming and participating.